En el corazón de un pueblo tranquilo, donde florecen las rosas, los secretos se pudren bajo las raíces. Riddle Town no aparece en ningún mapa. Existe entre el silencio y la sospecha.
Miss Marple and the Murder That Never Was. Such a peculiar piece, murmured Miss Marple to her companion, Miss Hartnell, who sat rigidly beside her, clutching her handbag as though someone might snatch it at any moment. Dear Mrs. Fortescue always did have such distinctive taste. The object in question, a rather gaudy Victorian epigun that had been donated by the late Mrs. Fortescue's estate, was received by his wife with an expression that suggested she was already calculating how quickly she could redonate it to next year's auction. Expensive tastes and no patience, Miss Hartnell agreed with satisfaction. Why, I heard from Mrs. Price Ridley that Lydia was positively counting the days until her aunt passed shameful, if you ask me. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes drifted to where Lydia Fortescue stood near the auction table, her sharp features set in an expression of barely concealed impatience. At 28, Lydia possessed the kind of angular beauty that photographed well, but seemed harsh in person, all cheekbones and disapproving eyebrows. I suppose she needs the money, Miss Marple observed mildly. Young people today do seem to have such expensive tastes. Now, Dr. Haydock replied in his professionally soothing voice, though Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit she'd observed in him before. Let's not make mountains out of molehills. These things have a way of sorting themselves out. Do they? Mr. Weston's voice rose slightly. When we're talking about... He broke off abruptly as Lydia Fortescue approached them, her heels clicking sharply on the paved path. Gentlemen, she said coolly, I do hope you're enjoying the auction. We've raised nearly £300 for the church roof fund. Something flickered across Lydia's face, an emotion too quick to catch properly. Yes, she said after a pause. Aunt Millicent was always very charitable. Splendid. Splendid, Dr. Haydock said hastily. Your aunt would have been proud. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment. There had been something in the way Lydia said charitable, a slight emphasis that suggested meanings beyond the obvious. Such an intense young man, she murmured to Dr. Haydock. One wonders what brings someone like that to a quiet place like St. Mary Mead. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Weston said stiffly, I really must be going. Good afternoon. He strode away without waiting for a response, his shoulders rigid with what looked like suppressed anger. Lydia watched him go, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She moved away with the same clicking precision, leaving Dr. Haydock standing alone, looking troubled. After a moment he too walked off, heading in the opposite direction from Mr. Weston. Everyone needs a fresh start sometimes, the doctor replied carefully. Indeed, Lydia's smile widened slightly. Though some starts are fresher than others, aren't they? If you'll excuse me, doctor, I need to check on the tea tent. Mrs. Clement promised to save me some of her lemon drizzle cake. Well, Miss Hartnell said with relish, that was interesting, Mark. My words, there's something going on there. Did you see the way that Weston fellow looked? Like thunder. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her fingers moving automatically, while her mind processed what she had observed. Mr. Weston does seem rather troubled by something, she agreed. Though of course, banking must be such a worrying profession. All those numbers and accounts, it reminds me of my nephew Raymond. He's something in the city, you know, and he always says that figures can tell you the most remarkable stories, if you know how to read them. Stories, Miss Hartnell scoffed. The only story I'm interested in is why Lydia Fortescue is selling off her aunt's things with such unseemly haste. You'd think she'd wait at least a year out of respect. The auction was winding down now, the shadows growing longer as the afternoon light began to fade. People were beginning to drift away, some carrying their purchases, others simply enjoying the last of the unseasonably warm weather. It was then that young Timothy Lee came running across the lawn, his face flushed with excitement or exertion. At 17, He was in that awkward stage between boy and man, all knees and elbows and Adam's apple. Perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, she has reasons we don't understand. Young people can be so impulsive, can't they? Though I must say, Lydia strikes me as someone who plans things quite carefully.
I have been,
he panted. From the bank Mr. Weston sent me to find you. He says there's something you need to know. Something about your aunt's account. Miss Fortescue, he called out, skidding to a stop near the auction table. Miss Fortescue, I need to speak with you. Lydia turned to face him, her expression cooling several degrees. Timothy, she said crisply, what on earth is the matter? You look as though you've been running. He said it was urgent, Timothy insisted. He said you'd want to know immediately. The change in Lydia's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The controlled calm cracked for just an instant, revealing something that might have been fear, or might have been anger. I see, she said quietly. And he couldn't wait until Monday to discuss this. Lydia stood very still for a moment, then nodded sharply. Very well, I'll go and see him now. Thank you, Timothy. Well, Miss Hartnell exclaimed, what do you make of that? Something about Mrs. Fortescue's account. The woman's been dead for 3 months. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, watching as Lydia's figure disappeared around the corner of the hall. How very odd, though I suppose estates can be so complicated, can't they? So many details to sort out. But even as she spoke, she was thinking of other things. Of the way Dr. Haydock's fingers had drummed against his thigh, of Mr. Weston's barely controlled anger, of Lydia's smile when she spoke of fresh starts, and most of all, of young Timothy Lee's face when he delivered his message, flushed not just with exertion, she thought, but with the particular excitement of someone who knows a secret. Miss Marple gathered up her knitting and rose from her chair. I think, she said to Miss Hartnell, that I'll have a word with Mrs. Bantry about that Epergia. Such an interesting piece. I wonder if she'd mind if I had a closer look at it. The auction was over, the sun was setting, and somewhere in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, threads were beginning to tangle in ways that would soon ensnare them all. Whatever for? Miss Hartnell asked. But Miss Marple was already making her way across the lawn, her steps slow but purposeful, like someone who knew exactly where she was going, even if she wasn't quite sure yet what she would find when she got there. Oh, Miss Marple, Cherry exclaimed, her young face alight with the thrill of fresh gossip. You'll never guess what's happened. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, with the kind of pristine clarity that October sometimes brings to English villages. Miss Marple was enjoying her second cup of tea, when her maid, Cherry, burst into the morning room with barely contained excitement. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. Now, Cherry, do sit down and tell me properly. You know how muddled things can become when told in haste. Cherry perched on the edge of a chair, practically vibrating with news. It's Miss Fortescue, Lydia Fortescue. She's vanished. Clean vanished. Mrs. Bunner at the post office says she never came home last night, and her bed hasn't been slept in. Indeed. Miss Marple's fingers found her knitting automatically. How very unusual. And how does Mrs. Bunner know about the state of Miss Fortescue's bed? Oh well. Cherry had the grace to look slightly abashed. Mrs. Bunner's niece does the cleaning at Riverside Cottage. That's where Miss Fortescue's been staying since her aunt died. She went in this morning as usual and found everything just as it was yesterday, even the tea things from yesterday afternoon still on the table. Has anyone informed the police? She asked. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Lydia Fortescue was not the sort of woman to leave washing up undone. Everything about her suggested order, control, precision. And then, Cherry continued in a hushed voice, they found blood on the path behind the bank. Not much, mind you, but definitely blood, and one of Miss Fortescue's gloves. She paused dramatically, and Miss Marple waited patiently. Cherry could never resist drawing out a good story. Dear me, Miss Marple murmured. How very distressing. I do hope the young woman hasn't met with an accident. But even as she spoke, her mind was working rapidly. The path behind the bank was not the direct route from Gossington Hall to Riverside Cottage. What would have taken Lydia there? An hour later, suitably dressed for calling, Miss Marple made her way to the High Street St. Mary Mead, was buzzing with speculation. Outside the fishmonger's, Mrs. Price Ridley held court with her usual authority. "But the blood," ventured Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, "and her glove. Surely that suggests—" "Suggests nothing," Mrs. Price Ridley interrupted firmly. "A few drops of blood. She could have had a nosebleed. As for the glove, she might have dropped it at any time." Miss Marple paused near the group. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Such a beautiful day, though I hear we've had some worry about young Miss Fortescue." Now, Dr. Haydock's voice interrupted. As he emerged from the chemist's shop, "We mustn't jump to conclusions. Miss Fortescue might simply have been called away urgently. A sick friend, perhaps." "Worry?" Mrs. Price Ridley snorted. "The only worry is what she's done with her aunt's money. I wouldn't be surprised if she's halfway to the continent by now." Miss Marple noticed that the doctor looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that suggested a restless night. "You're quite right, doctor," she said. "Though one would think she might have mentioned such plans to someone. She seemed very engaged with the auction yesterday." "Yes," Dr. Haydock agreed, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "She was certainly focused on the proceedings." "Doctor," Mrs. Clement said hesitantly, "I don't suppose that is some people are saying that Miss Fortescue might have been unwell. Mentally. I mean the strain of her aunt's death." "Nonsense," the doctor said sharply. "Lydia Fortescue was as sane as any of us. Perhaps saner than some." He walked away abruptly, leaving the little group in somewhat awkward silence. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley said after a moment, "I must say, the doctor seems rather on edge this morning." Miss Marple made appropriate murmurs of agreement and continued on her way. Her destination was the bank, where she had a small errand that could, she felt, quite legitimately require Mr. Weston's personal attention. While she waited, Miss Marple observed Timothy Lee at his teller's window. The young man was clearly distracted, counting the same stack of notes 3 times, and still appearing uncertain of the total. £50, said his customer. Old Mr. Abbott, testily, "Same as it was when I handed it to you. Do pay attention, boy." "Miss Marple?" Mr. Weston had emerged from his office, Inspector Slack following behind. "I understand you wish to see me." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." Timothy flushed, and finally processed the deposit. As Mr. Abbott stumped away, the young man's eyes met Miss Marple's. Something flickered in them. Was it guilt, fear, or merely the embarrassment of being caught wool-gathering? "If it's not too much trouble," Miss Marple said. "Just a small matter about my account, but I can see you're busy with more important things." Inspector Slack, a tall, self-important man who had never quite forgiven Miss Marple for solving several cases he had bungled, frowned at her. "This is a serious matter, Miss Marple. A young woman is missing, possibly the victim of foul play." "Oh dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "Foul play? Because of the blood, I suppose." "Among other things," Slack said importantly. "Things I'm not at liberty to discuss." In Mr. Weston's office, Miss Marple settled herself comfortably and observed the bank manager as he took his seat behind the desk. He was a good-looking man in his mid-30s, with the kind of regular features that suggested good breeding and education. But there was something else there too, a tightness around the eyes, a controlled tension in the way he held himself. Mr. Weston cleared his throat. "Perhaps, Inspector, we could continue this later. I do have bank business to attend to." Slack departed with obvious reluctance, shooting suspicious glances at everyone in the bank, as though any of them might be harboring Lydia Fortescue in their coat pockets. "Well," Miss Marple began, "it's about a small investment my nephew recommended. But first I must say how worried you must be about Miss Fortescue. Cherry tells me you raised the alarm when she missed your appointment." "Now, Miss Marple," he said with professional courtesy, "how may I help you?" Indeed, Mr. Weston's fingers drummed briefly on the desk before he caught himself and stilled them. Though that's all routine, of course. The change in Mr. Weston was subtle but unmistakable. His professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw underneath. "I'm afraid I can't discuss bank business, Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "Now, about this investment." They concluded their business, a perfectly genuine inquiry about war bonds, and Miss Marple took her leave. As she passed Timothy Lee's window, She paused. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "And I'm sure Miss Fortescue appreciated the warning. Whatever it was about, such an exciting day yesterday," she said chattily. "You were quite the Paul Revere rushing about with urgent messages." Timothy went scarlet. "I was just doing what Mr. Weston asked," he mumbled. "I see," Miss Marple said, though her mild blue eyes suggested she saw rather more than Timothy might have wished. "Well, I do hope she turns up soon. Such a worry for everyone." "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with forced heartiness. "Terrible business about Miss Fortescue, isn't it?" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I must confess, I'm puzzled by the location. The path behind the bank seems such an odd place for her to be." Dr. Haydock's laugh was just a fraction too loud. "Who knows why young women do anything? Probably took a shortcut." The doctor had no answer to that. He made his excuses and hurried away, leaving Miss Marple standing thoughtfully on the pavement.
To where?
Miss Marple asked innocently. "Riverside Cottage is entirely in the opposite direction." By afternoon, the village was in full cry. The blood had been confirmed as human. The glove was definitely Lydia's expensive cream leather, with her initials embroidered on the cuff. And now, most damning of all, her handbag had been discovered in the bushes near the scene, its contents scattered as though in a struggle. Miss Marple, returning from a thoughtful walk that had taken her past both Riverside Cottage and the path behind the bank, found Cherry in a state of high excitement. Inspector Slack was in his element, striding about importantly and interviewing everyone who had exchanged so much as a good morning with Lydia Fortescue in the past month.
"Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never believe it. They're saying it's murder."
Inspector Slack thinks someone did away with Miss Fortescue for her aunt's money. "Well," Cherry's voice dropped to a whisper, "they say he's been asking all sorts of questions about Dr. Haydock and Mr. Weston too. Can you imagine? The doctor and the bank manager." Miss Marple could, in fact, imagine it quite easily. She had seen the way both men reacted to Lydia's name, the careful control they exercised over their expressions and words. "I think," she said quietly, "I should like to pay a call on Mrs. Bantry. That Epernia really was quite remarkable, and I never did get a proper look at it yesterday." Cherry looked puzzled by this apparent non sequitur, but Miss Marple was already reaching for her best calling hat. There were threads here, delicate as spider's silk, connecting all the players in this drama, and somewhere among those threads was the truth about what had happened to Lydia Fortescue. As she walked toward Gossington Hall, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of villages. They were like pools of still water, placid on the surface, but with all manner of currents running beneath. Drop a stone, or a missing woman, into that pool, and all sorts of things might rise to the surface. And more intriguingly, why did Miss Marple have the persistent feeling that everyone was looking in the wrong direction entirely? The morning room at Gossington Hall was flooded with autumn sunlight, as Mrs. Bantry poured tea for Miss Marple. The Epergne stood on a side table, its elaborate Victorian curves catching the light in a way that was either magnificent or monstrous, depending on one's taste. Of course Mrs. Bantry watched with amusement as Miss Marple examined the piece carefully, looking for secret compartments. How thrilling! Though I'm afraid if poor Mrs. Fortescue had hidden anything in there, Lydia would have found it months ago. Such a generous impulse, Miss Marple murmured, though her attention seemed more focused on the Epergne itself. "May I?" "I can't think why I bought it," Mrs. Bantry confessed cheerfully. "Arthur says I must have been overcome by auction fever, but since it was for charity, as well as anyone did, I suppose." She was rather a recluse these last few years. After her husband died, she seemed to withdraw into herself. Lydia was the only one who visited regularly, though I'm not sure how much comfort she provided. Miss Marple set down the Epergne thoughtfully. "They weren't close?" "Like oil and water," Mrs. Bantry said frankly. "Millicent was all sentiment and flutter, while Lydia was hard as nails. I remember once at a church bazaar, Millicent was cooing over some perfectly frightful embroidered cushions, and Lydia said, 'Really, Aunt, must you encourage such mediocrity?' Poor Millicent looked as if she'd been slapped. Oh yes, every Sunday, regular as clockwork duty. You know Lydia's very keen on duty." Mrs. Bantry paused. I suppose I should say, was how ghastly. Do you think she's really dead? Yet, Lydia visited regularly. I say, Jane, he addressed his wife. Have you heard? Young Lee, the boy from the bank. He's at the police station. Turned himself in this morning, apparently. Says he killed Lydia Fortescue. Mrs. Bantry's teacup rattled against its saucer. Timothy Lee. But he's barely out of school. Whatever would he want to kill Lydia for? Love, the colonel said succinctly. Or so he claims, mad about her apparently. She laughed at him, told him he was a child. So he followed her from the bank, and he made a vague gesture. Miss Marple's needles, which had appeared as if by magic, clicked steadily. How very dramatic, she observed. And he's confessed to all this. Chapter and verse, according to Tom Pritchard at the station, says he hit her with a paperweight from the bank, then hid the body, won't say where, though keeps saying he can't bear for anyone to see her like that. A paperweight, Miss Marple mused. How interesting. I don't recall seeing Timothy carrying anything when he ran across the lawn yesterday. The colonel shrugged. Must have had it in his pocket, I suppose. Anyway, slacks over the moon. Says he knew all along it was a crime of passion. After the Bantrys had exhausted the subject, Miss Marple took her leave, but instead of heading home, she directed her steps toward the police station. She arrived to find Inspector Slack holding forth to a small crowd of reporters from the county papers. Slack's expression soured slightly. The accused is being uncooperative on that point, but we'll have it out of him soon enough. Miss Marple waited until the crowd dispersed, then approached the desk sergeant, Tom Pritchard, whom she had known since he was a boy. Such a dreadful business, Tom, she said sympathetically. That poor young man. He must be quite beside himself. Tom, who had always had a soft spot for Miss Marple, leaned forward confidentially. Between you and me, Miss Marple, the boy's in a terrible state. Keeps saying he's sorry, but he had to do it, had to stop her. That's just it. He won't say, just keeps repeating that she was going to ruin everything, and he couldn't let her. Stop her from what, I wonder? Miss Marple was thoughtful as she walked home. Timothy Lee, in love with Lydia Fortescue. It seemed unlikely. The boy had shown no signs of infatuation at the auction. If anything, he had seemed frightened of her. Indeed? Miss Marple handed Cherry her coat. And what does Inspector Slack say to that? Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess. Dr. Haydock's been to see that Timothy Lee at the station, and now he's saying the boy's not right in the head. Says he's having some sort of breakdown. Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair, her mind working rapidly. A confession that didn't quite fit. A doctor insisting on mental instability. A bank manager who knew something about irregularities. And at the center of it all, Lydia Fortescue, who might be dead, or might be something else entirely. He's furious, says the doctors trying to help the boy escape justice. They had a terrible row right there in the police station. Mrs. Emmett heard it all. She was there about her stolen bicycle. Cherry, she said suddenly, what do you know about Timothy Lee's family? I see, and has Timothy always lived in St. Mary Mead? Cherry was surprised by the change of subject. Not much. His mum's a widow, does cleaning work. They live in one of those cottages on Mill Lane. Poor as church mice, they say. That's why it was such a blessing when Mr. Weston took Timothy on at the bank. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And then, just as the last light was fading, she saw something that made her put down her knitting entirely. A figure in a dark coat, moving furtively along the hedge that bordered the churchyard. The figure paused, looked around carefully, then slipped through a gap in the hedge and disappeared. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple sat at her window, ostensibly knitting but actually watching the comings and goings on the street below. She saw Dr. Haydock hurry past, his bag in hand, heading in the direction of Mill Lane. A few minutes later, Mr. Weston walked by in the opposite direction, his face set in grim lines. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment. Then she reached for her telephone.
Dolly,
she said, when Mrs. Bantry answered, I wonder if I might ask you rather a strange question. That iperde, when you bought it yesterday, was it wrapped, or did you carry it home as it was? There was a puzzled pause. How funny you should ask. I remember particularly because Arthur made such a fuss. It was wrapped, but badly. Just some tissue paper that kept coming undone. Why? Oh, just curious, Miss Marple said vaguely. One does wonder about these things. Tell me, have you unwrapped it completely? Well, no. Actually, I just stood it on the table as it was. The tissue's still stuffed inside it. I keep meaning to clear it out. But, I wonder, Miss Marple interrupted gently, if you might do me a great favor, could you look inside the tissue paper, carefully mind, and tell me if you find anything unusual? She heard Mrs. Bantry put down the phone, then rustling sounds, and a sudden exclamation. Jane, there's an envelope in here, sealed, with Lydia's name on it. Don't touch it more than necessary, Miss Marple said urgently. And perhaps you should telephone Inspector Slack. Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall within 20 minutes, accompanied by Constable Park, and wearing an expression of barely contained irritation. The discovery of the letter had interrupted his interrogation of Timothy Lee, and he clearly resented being dragged away from what he considered the real work of detection. I fail to see, he said stiffly, as Mrs. Bantry showed him the envelope, how this changes anything. We have a confession. The case is closed. Miss Marple, who had arrived just behind the police, observed mildly, it does seem odd that Miss Fortescue would have hidden it there. She was managing the auction after all. She could hardly have expected to retrieve it after the item was sold. My dear Lydia, Slack shot her an annoyed glance. Unless she planned to buy it herself. These auction things are often rigged, you know. He held the envelope up to the light. Well, we'd better have a look, I suppose. The letter, when extracted, proved to be written in a shaky hand on lavender-scented notepaper. The tea tastes different. My evening cocoa leaves me so drowsy. I can barely climb the stairs. Dr. Haydock says it's my heart, but I know my own body. This is something else. I pray I am wrong. I pray this letter will never be read. But if it is, know that I forgive whoever has done this to me. May God forgive them too. Poisoned, Mrs. Bantry whispered. She thought she was being poisoned. Then why, Miss Marple asked gently, did someone kill Lydia to prevent her from finding it? Slack's face darkened. Timothy Lee killed her because she rejected his advances. This letter is irrelevant. Is it? Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Consider the timing. Inspector Lydia was managing the auction. She would have handled every item, checking them for the catalogue. If this letter was hidden in the Epurgny from the start, she would have found it weeks ago. Then someone else put it there, Slack said dismissively. Before Slack could respond, Constable Park cleared his throat nervously. Sir, there's something else about the will Mrs. Fortescue mentions. Precisely. But who, and why hide it at all? Why not simply destroy it? Miss Marple paused. Unless, of course, someone wanted it to be found, but not immediately. What about it? Well, sir, I was talking to Mr. Matthews of Matthews and Creasy this afternoon. He says they do have Mrs. Fortescue's will made out 5 years ago, leaving everything to Miss Lydia. He's never heard of any other will. Slack's expression grew grimmer. Then Weston has some explaining to do. Park, get over to the bank, I want. He was interrupted by the telephone ringing. Mrs. Bantry answered it, listened for a moment, then held it out to Slack with a strange expression. It's for you, Inspector. The station. They say it's urgent. Slack took the phone impatiently. His face changed as he listened, shifting from annoyance to disbelief to something approaching panic. What do you mean, gone? He barked. How can he be gone? He was locked in. A pause. The doctor said. What? Sedatives? On whose authority? Another pause. Well, find him. Search everywhere. And get Dr. Haydock in for questioning immediately. He slammed down the phone and turned to face the others. Timothy Lee has escaped. Apparently, Dr. Haydock gave him sedatives for his nervous condition, and while the duty constable was checking on another prisoner, the boy vanished. The cell door was still locked, but he was gone. Slack rounded on her. What are you suggesting? How very curious, Miss Marple murmured. Locked doors seem to be no obstacle in this case, rather like Lydia herself, vanishing so completely despite all the evidence of violence. Oh, Nothing at all, Inspector. I'm just an old woman who notices things. For instance, I noticed that young Timothy was left-handed. He counted money with his left hand at the bank, yet the blow that drew blood behind the bank, judging from the splatter pattern Cherry described so vividly, was struck by someone right-handed. How could you possibly know? Slack began, then stopped. This is all irrelevant speculation. We need to find that boy before he hurts someone else. Or himself. Jane, what on earth is going on? First Lydia disappears, possibly murdered. Then Timothy confesses but can't produce a body. Now Mrs. Fortescue might have been poisoned, and Timothy's escaped from a locked cell. But who's the playwright? Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. It is rather theatrical, isn't it? Almost as if someone were staging a play, with each act more dramatic than the last. Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "Dolly, what do you know about Mr. Weston? He's relatively new to the village, isn't he?" "About 6 months. As I recall, came from London. I believe some sort of trouble at his previous bank. Nothing criminal, just a disagreement with management." "Why?" "I wondered. And he and Lydia, did they know each other before he came here?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Recognition, that's exactly the word." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "I don't think so, though now that you mention it, they did seem to take to each other rather quickly. Nothing romantic, you understand. More like they recognized something in each other." As she walked home through the darkening village, Miss Marple's mind was busy sorting through the threads of the mystery. A murder without a body. A confession that made no sense. A letter hidden where it was certain to be found. Eventually. And now an escape that should have been impossible. She paused at the corner of Mill Lane, looking down toward the cottage where Timothy Lee lived with his mother. A light was burning in an upstairs window, and as she watched, a shadow passed across it. Then another shadow, taller than the first. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself. Very curious indeed. She continued home, but her mind remained on that lighted window, and the shadows passing across it. In her experience, when people vanished from locked rooms, they usually hadn't gone very far at all. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered, what if everyone was wrong? What if the person who had vanished wasn't really Lydia Fortescue at all? The question was, who was orchestrating these disappearances, and why? The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a blanket of mist that night, the kind that muffled sounds and made familiar landmarks strange. Miss Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her bedroom window with the lights off, watching the street below through a gap in her curtains. It was just past midnight when she saw the first figure, a man in a dark overcoat, walking quickly but quietly along the pavement. As he passed under the street lamp, she caught a glimpse of his face. Mr. Weston. 10 minutes later, another figure appeared, coming from the opposite direction. This one moved differently, hesitantly, with frequent stops to look behind Dr. Haydock. Carrying his medical bag, he paused at the corner, looked around carefully, then turned down the lane that led to the old vicarage. Empty these past 2 years, since Reverend Clement had retired, and the new vicar had chosen to live in the modern house by the church. She rose, moving with surprising quickness for a woman of her age, and wrapped herself in a dark shawl. Years of village life had taught her the value of being prepared for unexpected nocturnal expeditions. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured to herself. The old vicarage loomed out of the fog like a ship run aground. One window showed a faint light, curtained but visible to someone who knew to look for it. Miss Marple circled around to the garden side, where French windows had once opened onto a terrace, now overgrown with weeds. Absolutely insane. That was Mr. Weston. The whole plan is falling apart. Voices drifted through the glass, muffled but distinguishable, which is why we need to. The doctor's voice dropped too low to hear, as it should. The boy's confession was supposed to end it. Now he's escaped, and Slack will tear the village apart looking for him. Calm yourself, Dr. Haydock's professional tone, but with an edge of strain. Everything is proceeding exactly as it should. A door creaked somewhere inside the house. The voices stopped abruptly. Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. Miss Marple shifted position carefully, mindful of the loose gravel that might betray her presence. As she did so, she noticed something that made her breath catch. Fresh footprints in the mud beneath the window. Small footprints. A woman's shoes. Then, shockingly clear in the silence, a woman's laugh, low, amused, and unmistakably alive. "Gentlemen," the voice said, "you're panicking over nothing. By tomorrow night, it will all be over. Timothy will be found, tragically dead by his own hand, unable to live with what he'd done. The case will be closed, and we'll all be exactly where we planned to be." "Is a harmless old busybody," Lydia interrupted. "Like all the rest of them, gossiping, prying, but ultimately seeing only what we want them to see." "Of course she was, just as we knew someone would. That's why you mentioned them so publicly to the good doctor at the auction. Plant the seeds of suspicion, water them with a few carefully placed clues, and watch them grow in exactly the direction we choose." The voices inside stopped instantly. She moved as quickly as she dared, using the mist as cover, but she was still too close to the house when the French windows opened and light spilled out onto the terrace. "What was that?" Weston's voice, sharp with fear. "Probably a cat," Lydia said, but Miss Marple could hear footsteps approaching the window. Then, blessedly, from the other side of the garden came a crash and a yowl, as a cat, a real one this time, knocked over a dustbin in pursuit of some nocturnal prey. Miss Marple froze behind an overgrown rose bush, thorns catching at her shawl. She could see 3 figures silhouetted in the doorway, and they were all looking in her direction. Back in her house, doors locked and checked, she made herself a cup of tea with hands that trembled only slightly. Then she sat in her kitchen, sipping the tea and thinking hard. "There," Lydia said with satisfaction. "I told you, just a cat." Lydia Fortescue, alive, not murdered, not even missing, simply hiding. But why? What could be worth such an elaborate deception? The answer, when it came to her, was so simple she almost laughed. Money. It always came down to money. No, this was about other money. The irregularities at the bank that Mr. Weston had mentioned, the nervous way he'd drummed his fingers when questioned Timothy Lee, promoted beyond his abilities, given a position of trust despite his youth. But not Millicent Fortescue's money. That will hidden in the Epergne had seen to that. The church would get everything, leaving Lydia with only a small bequest. "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said aloud to her quiet kitchen, "what have you all been up to?" She thought of Timothy, supposedly escaped but more likely hidden somewhere, that upstairs light in his mother's cottage, the 2 shadows, would they really kill him to complete their deception? She feared they might. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Miss Marple came to a decision. She couldn't go to Inspector Slack. He would never believe her without proof, and her nocturnal expedition could hardly be admitted to. But there were other ways to spring a trap. She smiled grimly as she climbed the stairs to bed. They thought her a harmless old busybody, did they? Well, perhaps it was time to show them just how harmful a busybody could be when lives were at stake. The game, as her nephew Raymond might say, was afoot, and Miss Marple intended to win it. By 10 o'clock the next morning, St. Mary Mead was buzzing with the news that Inspector Slack had called in Scotland Yard. The great Detective Chief Inspector Dermot was expected on the afternoon train, and speculation ran wild about what this meant for the case. Miss Marple, after a few hours of restorative sleep, was taking her morning constitutional when she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley outside the post office.